Okay. Hello humans. Hello humans. Okay humans, hello. It's cold. I'm gonna have to have the heat on for a while. It's like it's 49 degrees in here. It got real cold last night. It was like 36 degrees on the beach. Nothing froze down there, but we got frost, frozen water on the windshields this morning up here. Anyway, this is welcome to the Yule Woo. Basically, we're going to talk about words, sins, and crime. Okay, it doesn't seem like it, but we are. All right, so right up here, this image is not a bird, okay? That's not a bird in flight. That's not a bird with extended wings. That is the hull form of a Viking boat, okay? So to see it there, you see the bottom of the hull, it sweeps up. You see the central bow stem. And so I built one of these. I built a Viking boat. And they come on down. This is usually a single piece of lumber. There's another piece that connects. And then there's the stern. This is the bow. Viking boats are interesting. They have affected our history hugely. Most people are not aware of them. It's a huge jump in technology, right? I won't go into all of the details. Most people don't care about the history of boats. But fundamentally, Viking boats were stitched. They were stitched planks that were hand carved to fit that space in the boat. So most of the wood was removed from a log in order to get a specific plank of a specific shape in order to create this overall hull. Very sophisticated. You would not have built one of these. It is difficult to see how Viking hulls evolved. We know the various different ways of a central plank and dugout canoes and extending planks up the side to get freeboard, but Viking hulls are entirely different because they set out with a deliberate kind of a curve. So in profile, they have a tendency to try and do this. This is exaggerated, right? And so they actually try and create these voids here in the little gaps there, right? And it actually comes on down more like that. But in any event, so it's a hull-shaped design. It's unique in a couple of ways. First off, there were, I think I'm accurate, there were 12 of these Viking boats, massive Viking boats. Now, bear in mind, boat archaeology is interesting because up until the advent of steel, boats basically destroyed themselves and they weren't around to recover and learn anything from hundreds of years later. Viking boats are unique because there were a couple of cases in fjords in Norway where there were battles going on, and some of the kings took boats out there and deliberately sunk them in the mud to create hazards so other boats couldn't come in and attack them. So we found all of these boats. And then there were also funeral boats that were sent out there. So we found all of these boats sunk in the mud and preserved, from which we can analyze and learn things, right? The Viking boats were unique because after they had established the freeboard, they put in holes for their oars, but even that was unique because off of the side of the boat, all right, so we have this is looking end on in this kind of a profile in a cutout. We have coins that go back into the I want to say 600s or earlier that show Viking boats imprinted on the coin. So they went to, think of what they had to do, right? So in order to make a copper coin, you had to have a bronze, so you had to have something harder than the copper. So you had to go to the trouble of doing a lost wax or reverse, lost clay really, reversed imprint die making out of bronze. All right, so you had to get tin, you had to put it with your copper and other metals and get a little bit of carbon in there and so on to create a metal that was harder than copper. And then you had to sculpt whatever it is you wanted on the surface of that coin in that detail in very specific kind of a clay. And then you had to pour repeatedly because it wouldn't work the first time. You're doing it by hand. You might have 5 or 10 pours to get one good one. So you had to do it repeatedly, and then you would get a bronze die, which you could smack with a hammer on a piece of hot copper and make a coin out of, right? And so we have these coins that have Viking boats on the coins with the most magnificent sail structures you've ever seen. Sails we cannot imagine how they work now, because apparently the main sails were not just a square sail, they had little flaps in them, and these flaps were tied by hundreds of strings, hundreds of ropes to the people in the boat. Further, in profile, as the oars stuck out through these holes, between each and every one of these, there was a cloth covering that connected almost half of that area. So get this, if you're on one of these Viking boats, now these boats are balanced by rocks they'd find spots. These guys would spend weeks balancing these things after the boats were built, and also they'd redo it every year after they took the boats. The boats were taken out of the water in the wintertime, turned upside down and made into the roofs of houses, so that they would be made wet all the time and preserved, but you wouldn't be wet on the inside, right? Anyway, they would find these spots, put the rocks there to balance them and so on. So if you're on one of these boats and you're surfing across the waves like we talked about the other day, heading towards the shore, these mats right there would provide what's known as ground effect lift. They would make the boat lighter. It would be as though there were short, stubby wings that were sticking out on the side of the Viking boat. So we have priests in Normandy area of France, that wrote shit in their logs for the Byzantine Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, in the 600s, 700s, 800s, and so on, about the raids from the Norsemen, from the Norwegians, in the wintertime, right? And these guys would come on in, and the priests did not know how they would do it, but they would sail, quote, sail, or fly their boats up the sand, okay, way the fuck up the beach, so that they're not, so literally they were landing craft at that stage, right? And from the Norse side, what they would do would be on their way in, they would take a particular kind of a rock, basically a rock with a hole in it, that had a line attached to it, and way the fuck out on the way in, they would drop these and just let the line play out. So when they had to leave, everybody would pile into the boat, and then everybody would just pull on this line, and the boat would slide back down the beach into the water. They also timed it to the tide, so they would get the boats way the hell up at low tide. Thus, when they needed to leave, the tide would be up almost under the keel of the boat, so it was no big deal to get moving. This was good if you're taking women as slaves, this kind of thing, capturing food, because that was the whole point. They were running out of food up north. This is because of the ice age that was affecting everybody, and so they had to go steal it. This is part of Yule, okay? This is part of our Yule history. The Viking boats, and the Vikings and stuff, because, all right, so the Normans, were actually other Norwegians that at some point earlier on had sailed down there to France to steal women and this kind of thing, and said, well, fuck, it's a lot warmer down here. We're not freezing our ass off. I don't want to go back. And a bunch of them didn't, and they stayed there. And thus the Normans, the Norsemen, developed Normandy, France. That's where my mother's people come from. And so they were fighting their cousins, right? They were fighting their cousins, the Viking guys. Anyway, so this is all about Yule and sins and words and crimes. All right, I got to get this idea across here. So we are in the season of Yule. If you look it up, in like Wikipedia, which lies, they say that this is a winter season and that Yule was a Yule fest. So Yule fest that was on December 24th is actually the eve of that, so it's Christmas Eve. It was Yule fest, but the first recorded use of it is as the Yule tide. Okay, and so you see, Yuletide, you know, that kind of thing, right? Of course, because the Yule season is important to seafaring peoples. All right, so the tide is the indicator that you are at Yule. Yule is a season that represents the, basically it's the period of time when we have tides that replicate themselves for 3 days, okay? So it's the sun standing still, the solstice, that occurs on December 25th that causes the tides to be exactly the same for 3 days. Very, very, very predictable. And of course, the Vikings would use that to their advantage, and they would frequently raid during Yuletide. So this is a tidal reckoning. This is a tribal peoples, the Saxons, the Normans, the Utes, the Picts, the Celts, the Finns, and the Rus are all tribal people, all right? And so the tribal peoples, the white tribes throughout Northern Europe, were centered around Yule tide. In Finland, it's really freaky in some areas because the water doesn't move for 3 days. It is the spookiest thing you've ever seen, right? But it only occurs under rare conditions, and you can't go there every year and see it necessarily. But it's just quite odd, you know, for people that are around the ocean and it's constantly moving, all of that sort of thing. Anyway, so Yule Fest, if you look at Wikipedia, is supposedly based on a pagan. That means that they're defining it from the Holy Roman Empire's view, because they're taking this particular monk who wrote about the Yule period in the 800s, his view of it, right, in which everything that the Germans did was pagan. And the Saxons and the Frisians and, you know, the Dutch, all of these peoples, right? They're all tribal peoples, and they were all pagan relative to the Holy Roman Empire. And so he writes about it, and he has this particular prejudice, and he totally screws it up for everybody from that point on. Okay, so within the Saxon traditions, within the Saxon people's traditions, Yule is a period. Okay, it's not a single time, it's not a single day. It goes from December, the peak of Yule is December 25th for the next 3 days through to the morning of the 28th, right? Okay, and so that's the peak of Yule tide. That's the peak of the tide on the 28th. It shifts, and there you go. It depends on where you are at in calendar world, because now this is a little bit reversed, all right? So we actually now have it at the 22nd through to the 25th, and it reverses on the 25th because we've been Christianized, all right? So they wanted it to coincide with the shifting, the advent of the change, to coincide on the 25th, instead of the way that it was under Odin's time, and so Odin, the Germans didn't really, and the Norse guys don't really call him Odin. His name is Wotan, or its name, okay, Wotan. And Wotan means, at its core, it means breath, all right? It means to breathe. It means to respirate. It means cycles. I won't go any further down that, okay? But basically what they were saying in all of the liturgy, so to speak, of these tribal peoples on this particular time relative to Wotan was that this was the time that, so in the respiration of the year, the world is inhaled closer to essence for a period of time. We are allowed to soak that up to take in those energies, and then we are exhaled. So there's this change, the change of breath. We are exhaled out to express, and then after a period of time we're inhaled back in to get more essence and exhaled back out. So there's 2 breaths to a year, thus 4 seasons. These breaths coincide, coincidentally, with solar attributes, okay? Earth relative to the sun, apogee, perigee, all of these kind of things, and movements thus to that. So it is indeed reflective of astronomy and astrology, but the concept of Valhalla and all of this kind of stuff, however much of a solar cult it might be, just like Christianity is a solar cult, and Mohammedism, Islam is a lunar cult, right? Allah is the name of the moon. Anyway, though, as much as it is all of that, the halls of Valhalla, all of the structure, the verbiage around the Wotan experience does not follow a astrotheological sort of a thing. So there's no definitive representation of the zodiac in the liturgy and so on. It is acknowledged. There's festivals on the feast days which are accorded to the equinox and all of these other solar things, but within the structure of it, there's no mythology based around the actual zodiac. The lion and the lamb, right? The lion lays down with the lamb, or the ram, and so you get a Leo and that kind of thing going. Anyway, so to continue. All right, so Yule Tide is also Yule Fest, and this particular priest that starts us off with our definition of all of the Yule stuff that is replicated in Wikipedia from like the 800s was a staunch defender of the aggression of the Holy Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, because it was operating out of Byzantium, and so he had a particular propagandistic view of what was going on, and he took one word out of the ritual sayings of this and converted it over to a sacrifice cult. Okay. And so his thing was that the Huns, which was the collection of all of the Germanic, the Teutonic peoples, performed sacrifices on December 25th. And it is factual that a word that can be translated as sacrifice is in one of the repetitious ritual sayings of the day. But it doesn't mean sacrifice in the sense of killing a being. It means sacrifice of your sin, okay? Sacrifice of your pollution. So here's where we get into some interesting concepts. So we have the concept of sin, which actually means mountain, okay? So Mount Sinai, right? That kind of thing. But sin, for us, was for the Germanic peoples, for the Saxons, the Parisians, all of these people, sin was a pollution of your being, a pollution, an active pollution, a contamination of your being by a behavioral act, and also by a thought. You could have a sin of thought, et cetera, right? And so this was a personal affront, a personal damage. Now, and a crime, on the other hand, is a damage done to others. Now, you can have a single act be both a sin and a crime. You can have an act be a crime, but not a sin. So it might be a crime to litter, and it certainly is not a sin to litter, right? The act of littering does not damage your soul, doesn't damage your life, this kind of thing. This is an kind of a silly illustration, but you see what I'm saying, right? And so murder damages you. So murder is a sin, because taking another life, your ki, your anima, your spirit, is actively involved in the removal of someone else's ki, some other being's ki, from this plane of existence. and you don't have that right. So it's a sin. So murder is a sin. Now, it's also a crime, okay? But you can have as we've just seen, you can have an act of killing be neither, okay? So in the reality, in natural law, if you are attacked, you have the right and you must defend yourself. The right of survival, right? You have that right to exist. You're here, you have the right to fight, to be here. And if someone attacks you, they surrender their rights as a human. They become subhuman, a beast at that point, right? They become in the wrong. They've accepted the karmic retribution of that attack. So if you are in an act of self-defense, it's neither a sin nor a crime. Now, okay, so you got to get moving on this. All right, so more history here, and then we'll get going. All right, so there is this thing that used to occur and may still occur that has been ascribed to witchcraft and led to the murder of millions, potentially, of German, Austrian, Czech, Slovak, all of these women. And this is called, let me see if I can get the modern, I think it's modern, not, modernit. That's it. Okay, so hang on a second. So there's too many spellings for it, but here's what it is. In German, it's I-H-T. So nicht, right? Night. N-I-H-T. In old Teutonic instead of nicht. But nicht is, so this is pronounced Modranit, okay? Mother's Night. Okay, so Mother's Night occurred on Christmas Eve, on December 24th. It marked the shift, the peak of the Yule tide, those 3 days. And so it started on the 25th, and or on the night of the 25th, the Christmas Eve, ran through the 25th, and then ended on sometimes as late as the 27th or the 28th. But it was not a single night, and it was a point of sacrifice, of clearing yourself of your sins. And so the Germanic peoples would take psychedelic mushrooms in these rituals, in these feasts. Some people in the feast would just go and have big dinners and all of that kind of stuff. But if you had sins you had to shed and you decided you needed to do it, you'd go on Mother's Night and go to the local shamanic woman in the Germanic tribe, and they would give you a psychedelic mushroom thing and take you through a trip to shed your sins. And this was the sacrifice, okay? Because you were in so many different levels. I won't go into it all. There's discussions of it here in the book, in certain forms. We'll get into the book in a second. So the shedding of the sins was good for the culture as a whole, right? Because you weren't polluted anymore, so you wouldn't be polluting. You wouldn't the local culture, and you would be healing yourself, and so you would be healing the local culture because you provided part of it. And so this the Yuletide period was a specific set aside that was recognized, easily defined. Now, this is not to say that there weren't these healing traditions and things with the mushroom beers and so forth at other times in the year. But this is just to say that this was a special time for the reconciliation of both sins and crimes. And crimes were the damage done to others. And frequently, of course, after you've had these psychedelic experiences of this shamanic level, you've got to get on out there and you've got to, basically reconcile with all these people that you think you've done an injury to. And frequently you find out that you haven't, that they weren't aware of it the way you were, et cetera, but there's this sort of general healing. And so crime at that level would be reconciled, and frequently it was also the point of absolution, right? You would be absolved in the culture. The local tribe would absolve you of the offense that you had created the year before in that period of time that you were working all this out, right? So in that sense, there were indeed sacrifices, but not animals, people, that kind of shit, right? This was disinfo by the Byzantine Empire. Now, okay, so in the book, the Codex Oralinda, which is a history of the Saxon people that was saved from a flood, that references even Atlantis in here. Let me see if I've got that part marked. It talks about a bunch of it in the middle here. Now, this book is written, it has the original Old English printed in the back, and then it has the translations on the various sections throughout it. And this is the book that says the Saxon people cannot, gives a certain set of laws that the Saxons lived by, the natural laws of the Teutonics. And the Teutonic peoples even included the Anglos, right? Because ultimately it became the Anglo-Saxons because of intermarriage and this sort of thing. And so that also brings in the Celts and the Picts and the Jutes and these other people. The Jutes are up in Jutland, which we would think of as like Denmark and in that area. Anyway, though, so they were in here was an admonition that this whole area of Northern Europe, that they would not tolerate slavery and in their presence, right? And so it was both a sin and a crime to do so. And so we find that early contacts between Byzantium and the organized Saxon Council in Germany in southern Germany had a very bad ending, because the Saxon Council, which had gone down to see the emperor, paying respects, but also independent, sovereign, and so on, not paying tribute, went on down and discovered the place was riddled with slaves. And so reputedly, this large caravan travels across northern Europe, number of days. They knew there were slaves in the empire, but they were not aware that the empire basically depended on slaves. And so there was a building that 4 stories high that had an elevator, had a rope-drawn elevator, basically. And the Saxons, the council people, were supposed to go up to see the emperor, right? Lived on the penthouse, just like everybody. And it was a safety thing too, right? You couldn't get at him, because you could always cut the rope and no one could come up, that sort of thing. Anyway, so they were supposed to ride up this elevator, and then the Saxons found out that it was driven by beasts that were actually men. It was slaves. So in other words, there were a number of men that were lashed to a turnstile that turned the rope and then let you down, right? And so just grueling kind of a thing. And so they refused and took off. The emperor got a big bee up his butt, and thereafter there was war. And so for hundreds of years, the Byzantine Empire and the Hunnish clans didn't get along, and most of the and ultimately, the Byzantine Empire came on in and conquered through force. And when they conquered through force, they did a couple of things. They had giant caravans called trains, not trains, but carts, people walking, this kind of thing, right? And they were called the orphan trains. And what they would do is they'd go into these Germanic villages and they'd kill all the women of childbearing age, just hack them all out, except for the really pretty ones. They'd take them too, make exceptions. And they would put them all to death because of this Mother's Night. And then they would take all of the orphans and head them down south to be slaves. Now, so you see, the Saxons were quite right. You cannot tolerate slavery near you, because sooner or later you too shall be enslaved, as the millennials are finding now. They're slaves. Anyway, so the Mother's Night was used as an excuse for the German Inquisition. In the German Inquisition, that's when they came on in and declared all these women to be witches because they healed people with psychedelic beers. And this ultimately led to the beer laws in like 1516 or something that forbade the putting of psychedelics into the beers, and once again trying to use it as a legal move to go in and find the witches and kill them and this kind of thing, because they knew this was inculcated throughout the Germanic societies, and the Germanic societies, the Saxons and these people, did not accept the religion of the Byzantines because it was so dependent upon slavery. It was all, their whole empire was basically run on a slavery basis. All right, so so it violated one of the major precepts of the Saxons. Now, bear in mind they'd had run-ins with slavery, being slaved to the Vikings. Right, ultimately the Vikings become captured by the same Byzantine Empire that goes in that period of time goes through the Germanic peoples, the Teutonic peoples, and we get this big mess that we're in now. And the winners, the victors, the Byzantine Empire, which was Holy Roman Empire, which was Christian, run by the Catholic Church, puts their stamp on everything, and that's why we get Mother's Night as being a night of sacrifice as opposed to a night of healing. Okay, that's why we have all of these kind of things. And this comes down to sin and crime. Because in my way of thinking, there is an original sin and an original crime, all right? And it is even referenced in this book at the very end. Now, the Codex here is an old fucking book in ancient English that needs translation because you cannot read it in its native form. But some of the words you can pick out, right? Because they're close enough. Anyway, the original sin in here is called name stealing. And there's a whole chapter on it. And it begins back here with the Rika, the stealing of the titles. Okay? Fascinating. Because they go on here to say that you can, all right, it is a sin to be a name stealer. All right, and they are talking about word alteration at a very, very, very deep level. So they're not, they reference in here stealing of titles. So, you know, puffing yourself up and saying, you know, I'm the greatest. That would be one way, right? I'm the greatest, whatever. Another way would be stealing through impersonation or being an imposter to a title, right? A claim to a title you didn't really earn that was not bestowed is also name stealing. But then there's all kinds of name stealing that goes back to the alteration of language. And so this is where we get into the ultimate crime, because both sins and crimes are magnified and removed versus, you know, so magnification versus removal, both of those occur through words. So there's the crime of secrecy that is removed by a discussion of whatever the underlying crime was. Okay, so the cover-up, right? So a cover-up is always what gets them, because you have to alter the language in order to cover up the original crime. And so you get into more and more compounding of name stealing, lying, right? And so lying at its core is a major fucking sin here. And they spend a number of days, number of pages discussing the ramifications as a sin for name stealing. When, as a result, discord and division sneaked into the households and complaints were made about it, they said, okay, and they said, so-and-so is, every man shall be a father of his household, therefore he shall also be the master and the judge. And they shall judge through arbitrariness the language that is being employed by those who are within the household. And it goes on and on. And it basically, in a sense, is describing a religious viewpoint, or a cultish viewpoint, as the Byzantine Empire would have it, of these people as a people attempting to reach certain conclusions, okay? Because what this whole thing is, the whole codex is a capturing of all of these, a saving, a rescue of all of these pages that had maintained a history, an oral tradition that had been written down of all of these natural laws. And the natural laws were things like, you know, you can't be a slaver, right? And you got to treat people fair, all of this kind of stuff, right? But at its core, all of the crimes go back to name stealing in one form or another. And so, as a linguist, even in a radical linguist, self-declared, and so on, name stealing really resonates with me. Okay, so in my own history, I had an enlightenment experience in 1986. You know, the blinding flash of light and all of this kind of stuff, weird visions and shit. And that very night, this was like in March of 1986, or 7, it was actually in 87. We moved in 86. So in March of 87, I had this enlightenment experience. You know, you think it only takes a half a second, it turns out it's fucking hours, that sort of thing. And thereafter, I was constantly driven to apply the appropriate name, the appropriate word to things, right? And then I find other people that have also had these experiences, and many of them will say, thereafter, I must apply the correct word. You know, basically they're saying they're driven to it. You can't help yourself. And that's why I struggle to get the appropriate word for that appropriate thing. And so I know from reading people's written material who has had this level of linguistic, anyway, expression due to an enlightenment experience. And I say that, you know, and I know Buckminster Fuller had it. Anyway, though, so I've had that, and in doing so, there's something that about the experience that where you want to use the correct word for things, you will hunt and hunt and hunt, and you discover over time there's another flow that's moving through you relative to that action, and that flow is complexity versus simplicity. And so we discover that name stealing is based on trying for complexity, and you are trying to make yourself greater. You're altering things to make it more than it is. You're magnifying it in some way. For whatever reasons, it builds towards complexity, and we find that complexity versus simplicity turns out in going through life is easily determined to be intellect versus wisdom. So wisdom's always simple, right? The intelligence always drives us towards complexity. Complexity is not necessarily wise. Frequently that is the case, right? And so one glaring example for me is complexity would be rockets trying to get us off planet versus a mag drive. And we haven't completely invented them yet, but there's nothing stopping us from applying our intellect, getting up to the complexity, getting wise enough to seek the simplicity, and then coming up with it. It's simple in concept. Now we just have to find the materials that will allow this concept to be actuated. So instead of literally hundreds of feet or yards or maybe even miles of piping and rockets to deliver fuel and all of this kind of shit, towering mountains of steel and stuff, over here you got a 40-foot little critter with a little tiny machine that goes and it flings you out into space based on the already existing magnetic interaction of the planets, right? So if we think about the world in an appropriate way, in a very simplistic way, often overlooked by academics and scientists, we find that Earth and Mars maybe, and Venus out here, depending on where we are in the sun, all of these have energy bodies, right? These energy bodies we can think of and they're labeled by physicists and stuff as their magnetosphere, right? The sphere of magnetism around the planet, and it radiates out, and we know that it decreases on 1/4 of the distance squared kind of thing as it goes out, but it doesn't mean that it dissipates, doesn't mean that it ends. It just means that it gets to the point where it's below our ability to detect it, but it's still there. And so here on Earth, we get in our little mag drive critter, and we just go zoom out to that point where these two fields interact. And then we go zoom down to that point, right? Just boink, boink, we're there, because we're interacting with the magnetic fields as is described in Boscovich's Theoria Naturalis Philosophiae, or other books about the ether, because magnetism is a known pervasive modality of the ether that you can use to, and that's what these Tic Tac things use to fly around on. I mean, that's quite obvious just looking at the tells that come on out of there, out of the Tic Tac videos. Okay, so, all right, so I would prefer to be wise as opposed to be really intelligent, right? Because I'm going to just be driving myself crazy with complexity when it's not necessary. I'm lazy. I like simple. I don't want to have to build the big rocket. I only have to want to conceptualize for a lot of years and then build the little 40-foot floating RV. Anyway, so we're coming into our Yule period. Our Yule tide this year is going to be affected by global mass name stealing. So the Teutonics, that society, that class of humans within humanity, have allowed their social order over time to lose the natural law that we see captured and put in here, and it has led to vast quantities of name stealing, which has polluted everything. And we see this now, all these lies about the injections. We see all the name stealing that Fauci does, claiming to be science and all of this kind of thing, right? He's name stealing even in his own head. He's living in a complexity that's driving us all crazy. We should be living in a wisdom that calms us all down and gets us out of all of this kind of shit. There are admonitions within the Codex Oralinda about how to deal with things, right? And I'm not going to go into this. The Codex Oralinda is not a religious book. It's not like a Bible. It's a replication of a personal family collection of books that were saved from a flood way the fuck back, right? Way the fuck back in the 800s or earlier. Some of this is questionable. Anyway, so we're in this weird time when we're going to be threatened both with rockets. We're threatened with complexity that is very difficult to understand. The complexity of the global organized crime gang that has been masquerading as independent governments for hundreds of years has now reached the point where they're coming out. They're shedding their name stealing for all of us to see that they're not really independent governments. They're all acting in concert, in lockstep with Klaus Schwab. They've got the religions tied in. They've even got Sadhguru's religion out of India, bringing in millions of humans into this effort for them, right? It's really pervasive. It's difficult. You can't escape it. We must confront it. And so now the complexity is being revealed to us. We've got to decide how to deal with it, and so on. The complexity that we're going to be facing at the moment, the pollution of the social order by all the name stealing, is including complexity that is these the K-Club missiles, okay? And so I haven't commented on it because I don't want to betray things, but it's out there now. This is primarily an East Coast thing, but it's also happening here on the West Coast with all the container ships that are offshore. I can say that it is certain that there is something going on based entirely on my observation of local military air traffic. And I'll just let it go at that. It's not the same level as what we're seeing on the East Coast. Why that should be, I don't know. But it is true that there is much more complexity being shown around this issue on our southern, southeastern area of the country. So this is a legit, serious threat and a legit, serious thing that we need to be concerned about. But people are working it at this moment. Okay, so from there, from finding what we need to find when it can be found, we can get into seeing who else is doing name stealing. And you see how name stealing becomes just this pervasive thing that destroys the whole of the social order if you allow it. And one of the things that okay, so this is another aspect of Mother's Night, okay? Psychedelic mushrooms are known, and personally known by me, but also known in general by scientists. Sapolsky, the behavioralist, the master behavioralist, he's the master of behavior. He even wrote a book called Behave, and he's the master behavioralist on this planet now. Anyway, even he acknowledges that okay, so psychedelic mushrooms, as opposed to mescaline, derived from a number of cactus, but most frequently San Pedro cactus, and also the synthetics, the phenylamines, the LSD, and so on. They don't count. But psychedelic mushrooms affect the linguistic center of the brain profoundly. Mescaline affects the time center of the brain, okay, profoundly, altering it basically forever. Neurogenic, it makes new cells. So mushrooms, as was taken on Mother's Night, altered your linguistic center. So they cured your name stealing. They altered your interrelationship with words that affects the whole of your brain. And now, it didn't necessarily, it takes you weeks to recover from from a good shamanic level of psychedelic. And so there's all of the stuff in here about the time when these people are soft and squishy afterwards and how you're supposed to treat them and this kind of stuff, right? Again, going to the wisdom of it all. But this is the time that we traditionally cure our name stealing. There are reasons to understand that there are astrological influences, astronomical influences, these energy bodies of the planets that are affecting us, so that we can, if we're harmonious, we see that this is a good time to do resurrection and healing of name stealing, right? And recovering the social order. And as I say, it's an issue of complexity versus wisdom, complexity versus simplicity. And so I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. We've gone through almost everything here. Just as an aside, I think that's it at this point. So for instance, if you look at language, then you see that the name stealers are ramping up this idea of the Ukraine, Russia versus the Ukraine, okay? If you look at name stealing, if you look at how people use words, if you look at the linguistics involved, and you go look at what Putin is saying, Vladimir Putin, El Presidente of Russia, he's freaked out by this global international cult of crime, of pedophilia crime, that is ruling most of the fucking world, and he's reacting to that. He doesn't want the Ukraine. He doesn't want to deal with the problems. He knows it's a complexity hell, right? And all of the people that are doing the name stealing are the ones that are pimping the idea, because that's in their interest to take us down that level of complexity. So if you want to find out about this stuff, go and look at what these individuals are saying. He is not lying in the way that he uses the language. He could lie within the words he's choosing, but the way in which he uses the language is not a lie. He's not name stealing in that. So I'm not worried about the Ukraine, I'm somewhat worried about the Chinese and Taiwan, but slightly less so when I look at the language. These countries have their own fucking problems around name stealing causing their issues, and we're at that point in time where all of this shit gets really ramped up. So as we go forward through the Yule period here, into our Yule Woo, we'll find more and more and more references, coming back to the name stealers, the globalists et al., and their intent to push us into complexity because they're driven by intellect, right? And so you're also going to see the universe is going to be providing this alternative. And the people are gravitating towards the alternative. They're gravitating towards the simplicity of the truth as opposed to the Wokian distortion of language, all of that. It hurts your head after a while, right? These poor kids, they can't think. Even they are gravitating towards people like myself that just, repetitiously keep going on and on and on about this shit and reducing it down to its base level of simplicity. So we get these rising amounts of influence under people, Max Egan, all of these kind of guys. And then, of course, there's the corresponding backlash from the name stealers, like throwing you off Twitter and that sort of shit, right? It will accelerate. I'm really sure that as we come out on the 28th or so, we'll have been to the point of the crises the crises that will dominate into January will have arisen, come up into our consciousness by the 28th. Okay, so it'll be between the 11th and 12th will be the incept date of whatever the hell is going to go on, and then it will reach an emotional peak on the 28th. And we'll be able to determine basically what the hell's going to be going on from whatever it is that has arisen on the 11th and the 12th. Because I don't know where the name stealers are going to take us, right? They're the ones that are altering the language, and we're gradually recovering it. We're gradually pulling it back. And so we're saying, no, he's not a racist. You're altering the language, and your brain's all fucked up. And we're saying, no, you can't bring up a stupid-ass school shooting and expect me to alter my life because of your Wokian feelings. And in fact, just to show you, I'm going to go out and buy 10 more guns and a couple of thousand more rounds of ammo. And we're just not going to discuss this shit. Anytime you bring it up, I'm going to say, Australia, motherfucker, Australia. Go back and suck a vax. So anyway, this is the point of the healing, right? The Mother's Night. So we're coming up to Mother's Night, and we can't all force them to take the drug and cure themselves of name stealing, but the social order is going to be dealing with the name stealers. And that's about that's about it. I got to, of course, get back to my bread. It's about raised. I've got to see how we're going. Sourdough today. Sprouted wheat flour. I'll let you know how it comes out. I'm posting on Telegram these days, and pretty much that's it. Really busy. We've got all kinds of shit happening, and it's going to get even more busy over these next couple of weeks of the Yule. So, awatahe to the Yule, guys.